It was a normal afternoon in the small neighborhood, the kind where the streets were calm and people went about their daily lives without much trouble. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm orange light on the old buildings and quiet homes. On the corner of the street, an elderly woman walked slowly along the sidewalk, her steps measured and cautious. She had lived in this neighborhood for years, known by many for her kindness and the wisdom that came with age. Her name was Mrs. Harper. She didn't have much, but she had always been content with what life had given her. She spent her days tending to her small garden, chatting with neighbors, and keeping to herself. Today, though, things would not be as peaceful as usual. As Mrs. Harper made her way down the street, she passed by a group of police officers who had gathered near the corner. They were talking amongst themselves, unaware of her presence. But something in the air felt different today. The officers, usually calm and professional, had an edge about them that Mrs. Harper noticed immediately. Their eyes were sharp and their voices were raised in anger as they discussed something that she couldn't hear. She kept walking, hoping to pass by without drawing attention to herself. But just as she reached the officers, one of them turned and saw her. He frowned. "Hey, what are you doing here?" he snapped. Mrs. Harper, startled by the sudden attention, took a step back, unsure of what was happening. "I'm just walking home, officer," she replied softly, her voice trembling. But the officer didn't seem to care. "You're in the wrong area," he said, his tone growing colder. Mrs. Harper's heart began to race. She had lived here her whole life, and she had never been told that she couldn't walk down the street. Confusion settled in her mind as the other officers started to approach. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, looking at the officer who had stopped Mrs. Harper. Before the woman could speak, the officer grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her towards him. "Let go of me," Mrs. Harper cried out, trying to free herself. But the officer's grip was too tight. The situation quickly escalated. More officers surrounded her, and her weak attempts to push them away were met with laughter and mocking words. Mrs. Harper's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't know what to do. She was alone, frail, and now completely surrounded by angry men in uniforms. She had never been in trouble in her life, but now she was being treated like a criminal. "What are you going to do about it, old woman?" one officer sneered, shoving her to the ground. Mrs. Harper hit the pavement hard, pain shooting through her body. She cried out, but no one seemed to care. The officers stood around her, laughing and making cruel jokes. She felt helpless, humiliated, and afraid. Why was this happening to her? What had she done to deserve this? The world around her seemed to blur as she struggled to regain her breath. She was terrified, alone, and the more she tried to get up, the more they pushed her down. For a moment, it felt like the end. She couldn't fight back. She couldn't even get up. Tears streamed down her face as the pain from the fall and the treatment sunk in. But just as the officers were getting more aggressive, something changed. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the street, growing louder with every second. The officers didn't seem to notice at first, too focused on their cruelty. But the crowd that had gathered began to murmur. "What's going on?" someone asked. It was then that they saw him, Mike Tyson, the man who had once been the most feared fighter in the world. He wasn't just any bystander. He was someone who had faced countless battles in the ring, but now he was walking towards the scene with determination in his eyes. He had been passing through the neighborhood when he saw the commotion and immediately recognized what was happening. He didn't know the woman, but he could see the injustice unfolding before him. Tyson's eyes narrowed as he saw the officers surrounding the elderly woman, treating her as if she were a criminal. His heart raced. He didn't have time to think. He acted on instinct, the same instinct that had made him a legend in the ring. The crowd stood in silence, unsure of what would happen next. Was Tyson going to fight the officers, or was he going to step in and stop them? No one knew, but all eyes were on him now. The air was thick with tension as Mike Tyson moved closer to the scene. His eyes were locked on the group of officers who had surrounded the old woman, who now lay helplessly on the cold pavement. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the street, louder with each step. The crowd that had gathered seemed to hold their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Tyson, once feared for his power in the ring, was now the unexpected force of justice. His mind raced. He had seen violence before, both in the ring and in the streets, but this was different. This was an innocent woman being mistreated for no reason at all. He couldn't just walk away. He had to act. The officers didn't notice Tyson at first. They were too focused on the woman at their feet, too caught up in their own aggression. But the crowd began to murmur, and the whispers grew louder. "Is that Mike Tyson?" someone asked, pointing at the approaching figure. One of the officers, who had been the most aggressive toward Mrs. Harper, looked up, his face turning pale as he saw who was walking toward them. Tyson's reputation was known far and wide. He was a man who could knock someone out with a single punch, a man whose name struck fear in the hearts of many. But now his reputation wasn't what mattered. It was his actions that would speak, louder than any words. Tyson didn't say a word as he reached the group of officers. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make them stop in their tracks. The old woman, still on the ground, looked up, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. She didn't know who this man was, but the moment he appeared, the officers hesitated. For a brief moment they seemed unsure of what to do. "Let her go," Tyson said, his voice calm but firm. It was a simple request, yet the weight of it hung heavily in the air. The officers, taken aback by the sudden appearance of someone like Tyson, didn't know how to respond. They had been in control of the situation just moments ago, but now, that control was slipping away. One of the officers, clearly the leader, stepped forward. His chest puffed out in an attempt to assert authority. "Stay out of this, Tyson," he warned. "This is none of your business." Tyson's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch at the officer's threat. "It's my business now," he said quietly, but the force in his voice was enough to make the officers step back. It was clear that Tyson wasn't going to back down. The crowd had fallen silent. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The officers had been aggressive and cruel, but now they were facing something they hadn't anticipated. The woman, who had once been powerless, was no longer alone. Tyson's towering presence, his calm demeanor in the face of danger, gave her something she hadn't had just moments ago: hope. Tyson looked down at Mrs. Harper, who was still struggling to sit up. He knelt beside her, offering her a hand. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern. The old woman, still in shock, nodded slowly, her eyes welling up with tears. She hadn't expected anyone to come to her aid, certainly not someone like Tyson. She had lived a quiet life, and this had been the first time she had felt completely helpless. But Tyson wasn't going to let this moment pass. He turned back to the officers, who were now standing off to the side, unsure of what to do. "You should be ashamed of yourselves," he said, his voice steady but with a hard edge. The officers didn't respond. They stood there, their faces a mixture of guilt and anger, unsure of whether they should continue their actions or back down. Tyson stood up, towering over the officers. "If you want to make a real difference, you'll start by doing your job right," he said, his words cutting through the tension in the air. He wasn't yelling, but the force behind his voice made it clear that he wasn't going to let this injustice go unnoticed. For a moment, the officers just stared at him, unsure of what to say. The crowd around them was growing. More people had gathered to watch the scene unfold. Some were recording on their phones. Others were just there, watching with wide eyes. No one had expected Tyson to be the one to step in, but now they couldn't take their eyes off him. He was the calm in the storm, the person who had the power to change everything. Finally, the officer who had been the most aggressive towards Mrs. Harper spoke. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, his voice lacking the confidence it had before. "But she was resisting." Tyson shook his head. "She was trying to protect herself," he said firmly. "You don't get to take that away from her." With that, the officers began to retreat, their heads low in shame. They hadn't expected to be called out in such a public way, especially by someone as famous as Mike Tyson. As they walked away, the crowd began to cheer, their applause rising with every step the officers took. Tyson didn't care about the applause. His mission wasn't to be a hero, it was simply to do what was right. Mrs. Harper, still sitting on the ground, looked up at Tyson, her face filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. Tyson nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "I'm just doing what anyone should have done." As Tyson turned and walked away, the crowd began to disperse, but the moment would linger in their minds forever. They had witnessed something rare, a man who had used his strength not to hurt, but to protect. And in that moment, Mike Tyson wasn't just a fighter. He was a symbol of what it truly meant to stand up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. The street fell into a strange silence after the officers walked away. The once chaotic scene had transformed into something almost peaceful. The crowd, which had been filled with tension and fear just moments ago, now stood in awe. Mike Tyson had not only stepped in to stop the violence, but had done so with a calm that seemed to defy the situation. As Tyson walked away from the scene, his mind wasn't focused on the crowd or the attention he was getting. His thoughts were on the woman still sitting on the pavement. She had been treated like an animal, beaten down by those who were supposed to protect her, but now she was safe. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. Mike Tyson's steps were heavy, but there was no anger in them. He wasn't running towards something. He was walking away, knowing he had done the right thing. As he turned the corner, he felt a sense of peace that was foreign to him. It wasn't the kind of peace he had known in the ring. No, this was different. It was a deeper kind of peace, the kind that comes from knowing you've made a real difference in someone's life. Behind him, the crowd began to disperse, but many couldn't stop talking about what had just happened. Word had spread quickly, and before long, people were sharing their thoughts on what they had witnessed. Some called it a moment of pure justice. Others saw it as a symbol of strength. But everyone agreed that they had seen something incredible. The Gaio officers, too, were feeling the weight of the encounter. They had been in charge just moments ago, but now they were retreating with their heads down. Tyson had exposed the truth. They had acted out of line, and he had called them out for it in front of the world. It wasn't just about saving an innocent woman anymore. It was about showing everyone that real power wasn't about force. It was about standing up for what was right. As Tyson disappeared down the street, he could still hear the murmurs of the crowd, their words following him like a shadow. "Did you see that? I never thought Mike Tyson would do something like that. He didn't even fight back. He just stopped them." The whispers followed him all the way down the street, but Tyson wasn't looking for recognition. He didn't care if the world thought of him as a hero. He wasn't trying to be anything other than himself. He had stood up for an innocent person because that was the right thing to do, and for him, that was enough. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harper slowly stood up from the ground, her legs shaky as she tried to regain her balance. She had been through so much in those few moments, but now she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The fear that had gripped her heart was slowly fading, replaced by a sense of relief. The man who had come to her aid had been someone she never expected, someone she never thought would care. Yet, here he was, standing up for her when no one else would. She dusted herself off, her hands trembling as she looked around. The officers were gone. The crowd had started to thin out, but the moment still lingered in the air. It was a moment that would change everything for her. The old woman had lived a quiet life, but now she knew that not all hope was lost. There were still people out there who would fight for what was right. As she turned to walk back home, her steps felt lighter. She wasn't the same woman she had been just hours ago. The fear, the helplessness, those feelings had been replaced with something stronger. She was stronger, and she wasn't going to forget what had happened today. Not ever. Elsewhere in the neighborhood, the news spread quickly. People were talking about the event, sharing their thoughts and opinions, but one thing was clear. Mike Tyson had done something that no one else had dared to do. He had stood up against the system, not with violence or threats, but with the force of his will and the strength of his character. The crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation wasn't just talking about what had happened, they were talking about what it meant. As the story of the encounter spread, it became a symbol of standing up for what's right no matter the cost, a symbol of what true power really is. Mike Tyson's actions that day weren't just about physical strength, they were about the power of a moral stand, about choosing compassion over violence, about doing what needed to be done even when no one was watching. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the street, the world seemed a little bit brighter. Mike Tyson wasn't just a champion in the ring anymore. He was a champion for something bigger, a champion for justice, for the innocent, for those who had no voice. And for Mrs. Harper, he was a hero. The world had changed, even if only for a moment. What had started as an incident of injustice had turned into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. Mike Tyson, a man who had been known for his ruthless fighting spirit, had shown a side of himself that no one expected. Compassion, not for the fame, but because it was the right thing to do. As Tyson walked away, a heavy silence hung in the air. But this time it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the kind of silence that came from awe. People had witnessed something incredible, and the police officers, now retreating in defeat, had been forced to face the consequences of their actions, not through punishment but through their own conscience. Tyson had exposed their wrongdoings not with anger or violence but with strength and character. But the real change had only just begun. Tyson's action wasn't the final chapter of the story. It was the beginning of something larger. For the first time, people began to question everything. They questioned the system that allowed power to be abused. They questioned the way society turned a blind eye to those who needed help. And they began to ask themselves a simple question. What if we could all do the right thing, even when it's hard? Back on the street, Mrs. Harper stood alone, her body still shaking, her mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. The adrenaline from the fear she'd experienced earlier was starting to wear off, but the confusion remained. Who was this man who had come to her rescue? Why had he done it? She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't expected it. She was just an old woman alone in the world trying to survive. But Tyson had come to her aid, and now she had to come to terms with what that meant. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. She wasn't used to anyone caring for her. But Tyson had shown her what true strength looked like, not in physical force, but in a simple act of kindness. It was a lesson she would never forget. As the days passed, people began to gather outside her house. Some came to thank her, others came to share their thoughts, and a few came simply to ask if they could learn from her. Mrs. Harper had never been the center of attention, but now she had become a symbol of resilience, of standing up when no one else would, and of finding strength in the most unexpected places. The officers, too, were affected by what had transpired. They couldn't just go back to business as usual. Tyson's words had stung, not just because he had called them out, but because they knew he was right. They had failed in their duty, they had abused their power, and they couldn't hide from it anymore. The moment had forced them to look at themselves in a way they hadn't before. Could they continue to serve knowing that they had let down an innocent woman and the community they had sworn to protect? In the following days, a quiet change began to ripple through the neighborhood. People started to help one another in small ways. Neighbors checked in on each other more often. Strangers offered assistance when they saw someone in need. The community began to heal, not because of a single act of violence or retaliation, but because of the compassion that had been shown by one man at the right moment. And it wasn't just the community that changed. Tyson's actions began to spark a larger conversation. The media, once quick to portray him as a villain, now found themselves scrambling to report on his unexpected role as a hero. But the story wasn't about his fame. It was about his actions, his character, and the lessons he had taught people. Tyson, however, didn't want the attention. He didn't want to be called a hero. In fact, he was uncomfortable with the praise. For him, the decision to step in had been simple. It wasn't about being seen, it was about doing what was right. He didn't need recognition to validate his actions. He had done it because he believed in something greater than himself. He believed in standing up for others when they couldn't stand up for themselves. A few days later, Tyson found himself back in the neighborhood, walking past the very spot where the confrontation had taken place. This time, the scene was different. The police officers were there, but they weren't the same as before. They were talking to community leaders, listening to concerns, and showing signs of remorse. The street was calmer now, more peaceful. The air wasn't filled with the same tension that had once threatened to boil over. It was as if everything had been reset. Mike Tyson walked by them, giving a small nod in their direction. One of the officers, the one who had been the most vocal earlier, stepped forward. We all owe you an apology," he said quietly, his voice filled with genuine regret. Tyson didn't say anything in return. He simply nodded, acknowledging the apology. He didn't need an explanation, and he didn't need their words. The apology was accepted, but it wasn't for Tyson. It was for the woman they had wronged. And then, as if on cue, a quiet voice called out from behind him. It was Mrs. Harper. She had been watching from a distance, her frail figure standing at the edge of the crowd. She walked slowly up to Tyson, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice shaking with emotion. "You saved me when no one else would." Tyson looked down at her, his expression softening. "I didn't save you, Mrs. Harper. You saved yourself by staying strong," he said, his voice low and steady. "But sometimes we all need a little help along the way," and with that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a neighborhood forever changed, a woman no longer afraid, and a world that had witnessed the true meaning of compassion. Days turned into weeks, and life in the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The streets were quieter, and the familiar hum of everyday life began to settle in. Yet something fundamental had shifted, like the aftershocks of a great earthquake that would continue to ripple through the community for years to come. It wasn't just about what had happened that day. It was about the lessons learned and the new strength that had been born from it. Mike Tyson's name was on the lips of every person in the neighborhood, but not in the way the media had once portrayed him. He was no longer the man defined by his fists, the feared fighter from the ring. He was something more. He was a symbol of what it meant to have integrity, to stand up for others, and to choose compassion in the face of adversity. But Tyson wasn't looking for fame. He didn't want to be immortalized in headlines or plastered on magazine covers. What mattered to him was the change he had sparked. He saw the impact of his actions, but he didn't dwell on it. His role in that moment wasn't about basking in glory. It was about sending a message to the world that had become all too familiar with fear and violence. True power wasn't in dominance, it was in empathy. The officers who had once been a symbol of authority were now in the process of re-evaluating their actions. They had been humbled, but more importantly, they had begun to understand the weight of their responsibility. Their badge wasn't a symbol of control, it was a symbol of service. In the days that followed, the officers began attending community meetings, listening more than they spoke. They worked together with the very people they had once alienated. There was a visible shift in their approach. The brutality that had once marked their interaction with the elderly woman was gone, replaced by genuine care and concern. The community started to see them not as oppressors, but as partners in ensuring the safety and well-being of everyone. Mrs. Harper, who had once been a figure of quiet resignation, was now filled with a new sense of purpose. The injustice she had faced had changed her, but so had Tyson's intervention. Her once dimmed spirit was now ablaze with a sense of power and resilience. She had found her voice, and it wasn't going to be silenced. She began volunteering at the local community center, helping other elderly residents who often felt ignored. Her story of survival and strength inspired others who had been too afraid to speak up, too scared to stand against injustice. People who had once lived in the shadows of fear now walked with their heads held higher, knowing that they had the power to make a difference in their own way. And Tyson? He had moved on as he always did. He wasn't seeking accolades, he wasn't after a statue in his honor. He had done what was right, and that was enough. But the quiet, powerful impact of his actions didn't go unnoticed. Everywhere he went, there was a newfound respect for the man who had once been the center of controversy, now a man known for his courage, his heart, and his unwavering sense of justice. Months later, Mike Tyson was invited to a town hall meeting in the neighborhood. The crowd, which once feared and admired him for his fighting skills, now came together to honor him for his courage off the ring. When Tyson stood up to speak, the room fell silent, waiting for his words. He began quietly, looking out over the sea of faces, both familiar and new. "I've fought a lot of battles in my life," he said, his voice low but steady, "but none of them mattered more than the one that took place that day." He paused, letting his words settle. "I wasn't there to fight. I wasn't there to be a hero. I was there because someone needed help, and I did what any one of us would do for someone who can't fight for themselves." The room was still. No applause, no cheers, just respect. Tyson wasn't looking for validation, but there it was, in the eyes of the people who had witnessed his act of courage. They didn't see him as the man who could knock someone out in a single punch. They saw him as a man who had used his strength for something far greater: humanity. He finished his speech with a simple yet powerful message. We all have strength. It's not the kind you see in the ring or in the gym. It's the strength to stand up for what's right, to protect those who can't protect themselves, and to be the change we all want to see in the world. We don't need to fight each other. We need to fight for each other. The audience sat in a deep, thoughtful silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The message had been delivered, and it had landed like a punch that didn't hurt, but shook you to your core. Mike Tyson, a man once known for his destructive power, had shown the world what true strength was. As he walked off the stage, the applause started slowly, building to a thunderous crescendo. Tyson, who had spent most of his life in the spotlight for the wrong reasons, now stood in the light for the right ones. He wasn't the villain anymore. He was a symbol of redemption, of doing what's right even when it's hard. And as the crowd cheered for him, Tyson didn't raise his hands in victory. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging the collective strength of the community that had been forever changed. A moment of injustice had led to a wave of change, and it had all started with one man choosing compassion over force.